very happy to be here. Thanks everybody for coming. The paper that I'll give today is really based on this paper that was just published earlier this year in Law and Society Review. I've been working through the issues that are contained in this paper and in this talk, obviously, for a fairly long time, and so it's very exciting to me to get to present this to various audiences that have different interests and positions in relation to the empirics of the paper. So I'll just start with a couple of images here. And think about how the taxpayer. See, in each of these images, you see, this idea of taxpayer money, the taxpayer being treated by the state, the taxpayer being screwed by the state, the taxpayer being chopped up by the state, and this very interesting kind of a representation of the taxpayer. And I would suggest that the representation, the popular representation of the taxpayer in cartoons and in the press and in headlines kind of imagines regular citizens in narrative form as aggrieved, perpetually wronged by bureaucrats, by politicians, and by other subjects. And that's really the thing that I want to be talking about, is these other subjects who are deemed morally unworthy of financial support or deserving of scorn in exchange for said financial support. And brandished in everyday political talk, the term taxpayer evokes this kind of frugal moral conduct, a righteousness about budgets and extraction and expenditures. And in effect, a taxpayer is an alert and vigilant political identity, a political subject whose judgment must be heeded and whose opinions cannot be discarded. And in relation to settler colonialism and indigenous settler relations, the context where I'm researching, the taxpayer acts as a form of political identity that is built around ideas about who pays tax, right? Who is imagined as not inhabiting the status of taxpayer, who costs taxpayers, things like this. And the tax imaginaries that I suggest exist around taxpayer identity, right, help to define citizenship practices around the state and political conflict. And I want to suggest that they're really, really important to the enduring centrality of tax to politics and the politics of tax. And in sum, the thing that I'm arguing in the paper, right, is that the taxpayer fuses fiscal concerns with white possessive racial logics, at least in the context that I'm writing and researching. And it comes to see how tax operates as effectively a form of white property in a settler colonial political sphere. So I just want to overview the paper a little bit here. What I'm talking about is how does the idea of taxpayer and tax dollars, my tax dollars, become sort of significant elements of settler colonial myth-making about indigenous peoples. Why is it that white people, white settlers in Canada, for example, right, come to figure themselves as taxpayers in relation to indigenous peoples? What benefits do they expect to have from this identification? What are the expectations that they see, right, that flow from this expectation? And what does it mean for indigenous people as well? And how does a concept like fiscalized racism, the concept that I'm calling fiscalized racism, that I'm going to define here as the sort of how racist ideas and practices are articulated through, as I say, seemingly objective and benign fiscal concerns. How does fiscalized racism matter to indigenous settler relations? And what are the sort of political moves that the taxpayer makes around indigenous peoples and indigenous policy? and what are the broad general concerns that we should be paying attention to in relation to both settler colonialism and colonialism more generally as a political formation. And it sort of strikes me as very interesting that a lot of the discussions that we have around tax as political beings, right, are really not necessarily about the empirics of tax, right? Or anything really that are closely resembling of any material truths about tax or the state of tax policy in a given state. But if we look at the social life of tax, and especially in my context, the social life of tax in a settler colonial society, we can see how tax relates to other forms of distribution, the distribution of property, the distribution of land, and citizenship, right? Who belongs to the state, who can be taxed, how nationhood is practiced through both taxation and the absence of taxation. And the literature that I'm drawing on largely lays within the boundaries of what we'll call fiscal sociology, but also other disciplines that have examined tax, including anthropology, history, indigenous studies. But I do think that a broad social study of tax that will cut across these disciplines will contribute to sort of some really interesting ongoing conversations that will help us theorize how tax works as a form of citizenship making. And obviously, I think tax within fiscal sociology has made a long rebound from early fiscal sociology back into the empirical and theoretical terrain of the discipline in a pretty interesting way. Like I said, amongst other disciplines that have become much more interested in tax as of recent: anthropology, geography, history, and then obviously some disciplines that have much longer standing interests in tax, like say law. But I'll suggest that the fiscal sociologists have mostly demonstrated that tax and tax policies have the capacity to exacerbate economic inequalities, and that they basically operate as systems of formal wealth extraction in some ways. And I think one of the interesting things about fiscal sociology is that it has mostly up to this point really focused on the formal mechanisms of tax, which makes a great deal of sense because obviously taxation is not necessarily an informal system within a particular bureaucratized system. But my suggestion is that we should not overlook the informal elements of tax, that the ideational structures that taxation conjures in our heads, right? So it isn't simply that tax as a formal set of mechanisms institutionalizes inequality, right? I want to suggest that tax comes to work on people as an idea or an imaginary, right? And so that's the sort of space that I want to position my work within in terms of fiscal sociology. If we look at the informal and ideational structures, right, we are able to see much more than the formal structures that exist in front of us, and how it is that people come to be governed, right, through tax and tax identity. So I'll turn now to the empirical terrain of my talk, and certainly something that people can ask for clarifications later on, because I know it's sort of highly specific to Canada, but I think there's some general takeaways in terms of the shape of colonialism globally. And in Canada, Indigenous people have a very specific relationship with the Canadian state. One thing for people to know is that a large number of Indigenous people are governed by a large omnibus piece of legislation that is called the Indian Act, right? And it effectively sort of lays out the government of Indigenous people, and extends to issues like land, property, governance, identity, and indeed tax. And it's a very problematic piece of legislation. It's existed for a very, very, very long time, and has contributed really quite extensively to the general oppression of Indigenous peoples in what we'll call Canada. And in the Indian Act, there are tax exemptions laid out for First Nations people, for Indigenous people, certain Indigenous people. But it's really narrow and it's place-based. So, for example, there are certain tax exemptions in terms of some sales taxes on reservations, reserves. There are certain tax limitations on income tax generated on reserve employment, income tax. But of course, there's a couple of other ones, but they're fairly narrow, right, and targeted. And given that over about half of the people that these tax exemptions apply to live off of live off of Indian reserves, right? Most First Nations people, most Indigenous people, right, regularly pay income, sales, and property taxes. And so it's sort of a misnomer, right, in Canada that like Indigenous people don't pay tax. But that's at the heart of this thing that I'm looking at, and why is it people believe that kind of idea? So, like I suggest, a lot of settlers think that Indigenous people pay no tax at all, and it forms kind of like the basis of that durable mythology of around tax, the settler colonial tax imaginary, if you will. Of course, there has been pointed out by legal scholars that there's different legal sources of the tax immunity that have been claimed based on either Aboriginal rights, through treaties that most Indigenous nations have with Canada, and then obviously through the statutory exemption through the Indian Act. Where does this flow from? I'll get into the context now of tax in everyday life, and this is the thing that I'm really interested in, right? Why is it that so many people in Canada, so many white people, so many settler people think that Indigenous people pay no taxes, and what does that mean for how Indigenous peoples are treated by settlers? And there's a couple of reasons that it's become such a touchstone for people, and I'll suggest that one reason is that the first issue is that Indigenous nations are nations, right? Whether we're talking about the Mohawk Nation, whether we're talking about Cree people, whether we're talking about the Stalo Nation, right? Canada is on the territory of over 50 Indigenous nations, right? All of whom still exist and operate with sovereignty on their land and territory. But when we think about that kind of thing in everyday life, most settlers don't think of Indigenous nations as actual nations. They think of Indigenous nations, right, quite simply as in a collection of Indigenous individuals, of people, not as actually nations with sovereignty. And so ultimately, people don't really understand that Indigenous nations see this tax exemption as kind of a relationship in which obviously one colonial state cannot tax another nation, right? It doesn't make sense. But most settlers do not understand that. They only think of Indigenous peoples as individuals who are Indigenous who live in Canada, right? When in fact, Indigenous peoples belong to Indigenous nations that operate in terms of with political sovereignty, with certain forms of political sovereignty. And this is just an interesting paper from an Indigenous scholar, an Anishinaabe scholar, Celeste Pedre-Spade, who just talks about this, dealing with the misinformation, let's say, about tax in everyday life as an Indigenous person. What are the things that people say to Indigenous people when they find out about these kinds of things? And I'll also suggest that it's quite interesting to think about the history of tax in both Canada and more broadly in the colonial system that has refracted across the globe over the past many hundreds of years. And there's a variety of ways that tax has been interpreted, but in the context of Canada, tax was actually sort of connected up with ideas about civilization. Right, like this idea that it was only the civilized that could be taxed. It was only those that had identified and shown themselves to be worthy of taxation, worthy of inclusion into the Canadian state, right? That tax would work. And in some cases, it was the goal of early parliamentary debate to suggest that Indigenous peoples were just simply, they were not ready for taxation, right? And then obviously some, but also others suggested that Indigenous people should be subject to tax. And that was also envisaged as almost a form of assimilation, right? If you pay taxes to our state, you will much more readily accept the colonial rule that we are subjecting you to, right? Anyways, I want to talk now about how it is that this taxpayer identity has become formed. I'll talk about this just fairly quickly. And in the Canadian context, I'm talking about this group right here, which is called the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. And it's a taxpayer group that has really helped to popularize longstanding tropes about taxes and Indigenous peoples. They basically argue that they stand for accountability and transparency and against government waste. And they have this kind of populist brand of politics that places them amongst a lot of right-wing or neoliberal political organizations. And effectively, I would suggest that their mission is to operate in the press as like a mainstream, independent representative of taxpayers, but that isn't really what they are, right? Effectively, they use these mundane tax issues, government waste, issues about accountability, things like this to fill a void and kind of give them cover for the reactionary right-wing politics and policy advocacy that they practice. And so I did a analysis with a research assistant that I had when I was at the University of Alberta, and we basically looked at every single document that the Canadian Taxpayer Federation published over a time period of about 20 years in relation to Indigenous people. And we found a variety of things. Obviously, we saw like the variation in when they were talking about Indigenous peoples, but we also looked at the different things that they had become concerned about over the years: accountability and transparency, democracy and inequality, policy and law, poverty, dependency, things like this. But in effect, what the Canadian Taxpayer Federation was about doing was that they were looking to create this taxpayer identity, the taxpayer subjectivity, right? And my suggestion would be that, in effect, the Canadian Taxpayer Federation and taxpayer groups like them that operate across the globe are not necessarily about advocating for taxpayer interests, right? But they are interested in creating taxpayer interests, right? They are interested in constructing, right, knowledge that then can be given to taxpayers that then informs their political conduct. And I suggest that that's very much the case in relation to Indigenous peoples, right, specifically. So to sort of examine those dynamics in which taxpayer subjects are constructed in relation to settler colonialism, I look at this law here. I won't spend too much time on this because we get into the weeds here. But it's the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. It was passed into law in 2013. And basically, it argued, or it suggested that all First Nations governments that are sanctioned by the Indian Act, right, needed to post their financial and remuneration documents in a centralized government website online for public consumption. And many people have pointed out, including Indigenous scholars like Mi'kmaq scholar Pam Palmater, have pointed out that First Nation governments were always required to give this information to the government. They were always required to do this, but which suggests that the point of the law was simply to make the information visible to the public, right? Not First Nations, but simply to the public, so that the groups like the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, right, would be able to use that information, right, to help create that anti-Indigenous politics that they became so renowned for. And so I want to sort of turn now to talking about how that happened, and how it is that the Canadian Taxpayer Federation was able to turn this law into a discursive struggle, basically, that would be able to render Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations as objects of fiscal concern, right? How is it that they could get people to think like taxpayers, right, in relation to Indigenous peoples, and therefore scrutinize them, and therefore surveil them, and therefore be skeptical of their sovereignty, right? Because it's my tax dollars paying for Indigenous people, right? So I analyzed a series of editorials for this Law and Society review paper. I analyzed a series of editorials, basically, that the Canadian Taxpayer Federation put out in relation to this law here. The editorials were written by various CTF staff between about 2009 and 2014, and they sort of appeared in media that ranged from big national papers to sort of local papers as well. And, you know, I'm not attempting to write a full historical genealogy of the taxpayer. I'm really trying to tease out how a taxpayer identity comes to fruition through this law and through the advocacy group, the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, which I will go through right now. So the first discursive strategy that makes its appearance in those texts, in the editorials that I analyzed, sets the groundwork for the legibility of subsequent forms of taxpayer identity formation. I refer to this strategy as a legal political bifurcation between Indigenous people, right, and taxpayers, which is a sort of necessary element to performing the boundary work that's at the heart of taxpayer identity, sort of the notion that there's a categorical distinction between taxed payer and untaxed burden, right? And it illustrates a pretty similar point, I think, to Camille Walsh's book, Racial Taxation, that's observed around the racial imaginaries of taxpayers versus tax eaters. And as I previously discussed, the sort of majority of Indigenous people pay tax in some form because of the limited scope of tax exemptions. But the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has consistently fought the attempts by Indigenous nations, by First Nations, to exercise those tax exemptions. And that's because it regards Indigenous peoples as non-taxpayers, regardless of whether that is empirically true or not. The CTF has pursued a careful strategy of distinction between taxpayers and Indigenous peoples in order to give the impression that Indigenous peoples are subsidized by an aggrieved class of white taxpayers. And one example is here, an editorial that was published in the Calgary Herald. The two authors of this wrote that the First Nations Financial Transparency Act was a necessary element of democratic citizenship and an opportunity for First Nations, hopefully Aboriginal bands, see this, basically First Nations governments, see this new law as an opportunity to grow their accountability to members and to taxpayers. So the bifurcation there between Aboriginal band or band members and taxpayers is very, very striking, and it sort of illustrates this particular vision of separation between these two categories that disassociates indigenous peoples from the category of taxpayer, and the bifurcation of the political legal category there can tell us a great deal about what the authors envisage as the referent of their writing and the addressee of their writing. And then in another editorial, the above one there, you see the quote from, that was published in approximately 20 papers across Canada because of press media consolidation, let's say, suggests here, right? We push the federal government to place reserve politicians, pay online so taxpayers and band members alike would know more about the reserve politician they saw in the newspaper asking for more money from Ottawa. Band members here, right, i.e. First Nations people, Indigenous peoples, are positioned as mere spectators, right, in their own governance, given that taxpayer is not actually a legal status that one holds except in dealings with the revenue agency, right? The demarcation doesn't exist outside of symbolically positioning Indigenous people outside of this ambiguous political category. Taxpayer and sort of and positioning the position of taxpayer as the fiscally constitutive subject necessary for Indigenous people to exist. So it sets up this idea of ownership. The discursive appearance of the taxpayer not only relies on the boundaries between taxpayer and non-taxpayer, it also requires that Indigenous sovereignty not only be ignored, but actively overruled as a general principle. In this sense, taxpayer subjectivity mirrors settler colonialism in Canada, in which legal institutions undermine the idea of Indigenous nations as nations, preferring to see indigeneity as culture, race, identity, or simply order of government. Taxpayer subjectivity or taxpayer identity regards Indigenous nations or First Nations as just another constituent of taxpayers, right? Whose ability to determine, self-determine is premised on the consent of taxpayers and not inherent sovereignty that Indigenous nations have. The CTF strategically discussed First Nations governments as a level of government, right, rather than as nations with control over territory, exemplified by this piece here that was published in The Province, which is a paper in here in British Columbia. And they write this, it's quote unquote, it's quote, the level of government very few British Columbians ever think about. More than 200 Aboriginal bands, each with elected chiefs and councils managing hundreds of millions of dollars in federal and provincial tax money. And first, this subtly quashes Indigenous claims of sovereignty and simultaneously dismisses bands as simply another level of government, hierarchically beneath the federal and provincial governments, and that, of course, few would ever think about. An explicit reminder of the expected reader, right? White settlers. So in these articles, often First Nations governments are basically portrayed as tiny fiefdoms, effectively, right? Barely large enough to warrant a level of government. But in short, they're also portrayed as real sources of government, right? But with this sort of diminished importance and stature, where their governmental activities and any monies that are spent by them, right, ultimately then appear unjustified to taxpayers. The next discursive strategy positions tax as property and security. Quote, this week, for the very first time, taxpayers and band members who cast ballots to elect those chiefs and councils, Indigenous bands, or First Nations bands, are getting to see the financial statements and political salaries for those bands. So in this element, they first identify that there are Indigenous peoples, those who have a real relationship to their community, to their kin, to their nation, and then second, the citizenship of settlers who are refigured as taxpayers. And in the taxpayer imaginary, non-First Nations people are entitled to participate in the governance of Indigenous nations and of First Nations, right? They have the right to opinion, they have the right to critique, they have the right to surveil, they have the right to withdrawal, right? The ability to say no more tax dollars, right? In which the sort of imagined taxpayer status not only sort of allows a citizen to exercise sovereignty over indigenous nations, it also guarantees that tax operates as a form of property, right? That guarantees legitimacy in the settler political sphere. And this echoes the analysis of people that have done this, some form of analysis like this in the US context and also in the Canadian context. Aloysia Goldstein and Eva Mackey specifically, right, who suggests that there's this deep contradiction in relation to taxation in indigeneity in Canada. And while they'll suggest that while the CTF is the stern critic of the state and of governing, it renders tax as a moral good and as a form of property, where participation in this reviled form of state extraction, because remember that the Canadian Taxpayer Federation is generally an anti-tax group, they see taxation, right, as necessary for securing the sovereignty of the settler state, right, and the political legitimacy of white settlers. The CTF holds up taxation as a necessary good in marking who gets to make claims against the state and concomitantly who deserves protection from the state. The very kinds of animating forces behind the taxpayer subjectivity are not just found in the strategic statements of organizations like the CTF, but in the everyday informal discourses that circulate about Indigenous people. The work that the CTF does is to invite taxpayer scrutiny and indeed resurrect existing taxpayer anxiety around tax and Indigenous peoples. And we see one commenter that wrote around the time of the FNFTA suggesting that in fact the historical roles of oppression, right, had been reversed, with Indigenous people now abusing taxpayers, right? And the quote from what was this, with some validity, it was said that the early explorers who landed on our eastern shores first fell on their knees and then on the Aborigines, which is again not a term that's used in Canada. Times have changed. Canadian taxpayers are now the ones being abused, right? So these taxpayer identities and the imaginaries they're at work here demonstrate this element of fiscalized racism and how settlers come to understand Indigenous settler relations through the fiscal and how these fiscal concerns are shaped by race. And so to come to see, to come and think of a taxpayer as a taxpayer is to perform this double move, right? The taxpayer appears free from the contamination of bias and identity and ostensibly makes good decisions based on reason and evidence and the common good. But at the same time, the taxpayer identifies and refigures the territory on which politics are contested. The taxpayer, right, is a subjecthood that contains a strategic move away from the idea that their ideas are animated by racism or by the structure of colonialism. But in order to perform this move of refiguring this political space, taxpayers, right, are able to then critique Indigenous governments, peoples, and nations, right, and enroll their critiques as objective and universal taxpayer concerns. So approaching politics from the position of the universal, from a position of disinterestedness, inscribes the double reversal that somebody like Cindy Patton might describe. The taxpayer is concerned only with the rational disbursement of state monies. They mark politics as an exercise in objectivity and themselves as the singular universal taxpayer, the rational participant in that process, and the ideal process, participant in that process. The move to the universal is itself a move to innocence. It's a move from having an identity to mark oneself as a universal, the universal taxpayer, the taxpayer. Allows settlers who figure themselves as taxpayers to believe that they are adjudicating Indigenous life objectively, from nowhere, free from ideology, right? And so to render indigenous life through the lens of the taxpayer is the strategic attempt to remove the adjudicant, and instead taxpayer identity become the utterances of the unmarked. The taxpayer groups rely on two key notions. Number one that tax and state coercion is bad, and that while tax should be scorned, that it does play a key role in constituting the state for those who have property. That is that tax is both bad, but it is also security, right? Taxpayer groups are animated by two impulses, creating critical impulses and capacities in taxpayers, and securing and maintaining settlement, the propertization of indigenous territories for a colonial state. And I draw here on Cheryl Harris, who suggests that whiteness in itself can be formed as considered a form of property, right? And she writes here, the settlement and seizure of Native American land supported white privilege through a system of property rights in land in which the race of Native Americans rendered their first possession rights invisible and justified consequence. This racist formulation embedded the fact of white privilege into the very definition of property, marking another stage in the evolution of property interest in whiteness. Possession, the act necessary to lay the basis for property rights in property, was defined only to include the cultural practices of whites. This definition laid the foundation for the idea that whiteness, which whites alone possess, right, is valuable and is property. And indigenous scholar Eileen Morton Robinson suggests that scholars must pay much closer attention to the possessive logics in white settlers. And the possession, the sort of possessive property logic that exists in this argument that I'm making, right, allows taxpayers to problematize specific arrangements of indigenous life, and allows them to invest their moral capabilities and political judgments into scrutinizing and skeptically surveilling indigenous politics and governance. These are directly related not only to the acts of dispossession that every settler benefits from, but also the right to speak about these issues constituted as objective taxpayer concerns rather than positioned settler politics or racist politics. Taxpayers come to view themselves as buttresses against the state's politically correct dealings with indigenous nations, and imagine this political sovereignty given to them through possession, right, as the right to make decisions about political life. White possessive logics animate this taxpayer subjectivity. And in short, the settler taxpayer imaginary, right, sees tax as able to provide protection against those it regards as lesser or illegitimate participants in politics. So in short, the taxpayer identity does not result in empirical claims. It is quite simply a form of security against those it imagines as impossibly inhabiting that very identity position. So tax is very interestingly tightly conceptualized around possession and through tax obligations and imaginaries. But I think it's a very interesting to think about the fact that the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, the activist group that hates taxes, why is it the fact that they would not actually think, oh, this is great that Indigenous people don't have to pay tax? And again, the clue is right here, right? It is the fact that they don't valorize this notion, right? And call, in fact, the tax exemption that's in the Indian Act as a race-based tax law, right? The exclusion from tax undermines, in its own way, right, Indigenous peoples, right? It resists assimilation in particular ways, but it also at the same time allows tax to function as a form of white property. Tax gives white settlers the legal, mental, and political language, right, to pronounce, to delimit, and to indeed eliminate Indigenous political claims, Indigenous sovereignty, and territory. Tax as a legal structure, right, is a performance of settlement, But similarly, tax imaginaries also help to solidify and perform settlement. Imagined as a form of property, it gives settlers possession over those who they believe do not pay taxes, and entitlement to decision-making, however ill-informed, over those nations that it regards as appendages, right, of their fiscal legal obligations. A couple of concluding remarks that I'll make in relation to the talk. I think one of the things that I'm interested in is thinking about a sort of comparative fiscal politics of colonialism. And, mine is just one case, right, here in Canada, here in relation to Indigenous settler relations. But I think that there's so much space and interesting space and some interesting work that has already been done, right, on the sort of comparative fiscal politics of colonialism. So I just wanted to place my work in conversation with this. I also think that more specifically in relation to my interest in tax, that is tax and identity, the informal life of tax, right? How is it that different taxpayer subjects are constructed? I assume, right, that the taxpayer is not a universal subject. That's one of the arguments that I make. And what does a taxpayer look like in different states and in different contexts, and perhaps in different colonial contexts? And then, of course, the last point would be, what is the sort of ideal tax status in a settler colonial state? And we need to sort of think about, in some ways, Indigenous sovereignty, right? And that's really at the center of my analysis. I think that the necessity of thinking about this with Indigenous sovereignty, and not necessarily just thinking, okay, what's the best tax arrangement here, but instead, how does Indigenous sovereignty figure into our understandings of tax? That's the talk. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks so much, Professor Kyle Wilmot. This conversation was actually quite interesting as it touched on various issues that we encounter in our day-to-day lives, such as the conversations we have in terms of what was the impact of taxation in the different facets of when it comes to gender, when it comes to wealth classes, when it comes to even companies in Africa, and how they're affected by multinational corporations. So indeed, this is a very interesting conversation, and it does affect various issues impacting many people in developing nations. And I would say that even if it's not developing nations, it could be indigenous communities. And even in our countries, I would say you'll find that there are still some indigenous communities that face harsher conditions due to how colonialism affected the tax payment, the development. For example, in Kenya, we have a railway line where a greater part of the country is inside the boundaries of the railway line, and some communities who are outside of that area often face economic limitations, social limitations, such that they're not able to participate even politically. So in that context, you find that was an impact of colonialism on us and how it affects us even today, because you find even if there's urban development, some of these areas still struggle with things to access to water, access to electricity, education, and such things are financed by tax. So with that in mind, I would like to welcome conversation, comments, questions on this, and we can see how we go from there. Kindly add that in the chat or raise your hand. As we wait for our attendees, I would like to ask Professor Wilmot, what is the impact that we see between the indigenous leaders and their citizens when it comes to how the subsumption of sovereignty when it comes to taxation, how does that impact the relationship between these two groups?
Sorry, could you repeat the second half of the question?
So how does the subsumption of sovereignty affect the indigenous leaders and their citizens?
Okay.
And from that point of view, how does that then affect maybe the human rights they could have in terms of economic and social development?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. That sort of subsumption of sovereignty that I think exists, the dynamic there. It's kind of addressed in this other paper that I mentioned, and it's in critical social policy that I did, and because in one way, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I've got sirens going off right behind my apartment here.
You're clear enough, thank you.
Okay. One of the reasons that the First Nations financial transparency exists, I argue, is that the federal government wanted to divide Indigenous peoples from First Nations leaders, from Indigenous leaders, right? So the idea that you would, post these salaries, you would post these different things, they would leak different kinds of information, and get people to think not necessarily about the colonial relationship that was at the heart of Indigenous people's relationship with our First Nations leaders, right? But instead start thinking about our relationship with our First Nations as a fiscal relationship. So in effect, the FNFTA, another element of the First Nations Transparency Act, right, was to get Indigenous people to think like taxpayers, right? And it was not necessarily an act of assimilation. I mean, it was an act of assimilation, but its goal, right, was like, how do you get Indigenous people to scrutinize their leaders instead of the federal government instead of the colonial government, effectively, right? So yeah, I think this is it's interesting to think about the sort of subsumption of sovereignty in relation to this, because for a lot of people, right, you have large disputes on these things, and I think that's fine, right? It's completely fine for people to scrutinize the First Nation government, to scrutinize that's the basis of politics, right? Scrutiny, conflict, things like this, right? That's fine. But to what end did the federal government desire, right? And in that way, it's a sort of that divide and conquer kind of strategy, right?
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting perspective to look at. I mean, this is on a broader perspective here, but one of the things that we have been dealing with in terms of, let's say, tax treaties is, okay, for taxation for us maybe comes in a different way, but one of those ways could be in tax treaties where you find developed nations always have the upper hand in, the upper hand in giving out different requirements that they would like in tax treaties, and that often goes to show how much power the colonialists would say have on the impact on the economy, the financing of budgets, and how that now deals with in terms of policy. You find that the people who are able to give the requirements that they want and to make them implemented and actualized are developed nations. And this can be seen in the case of UK, where a lot of the tax deals between UK and African and Asian countries have very limiting, I would say, advantages when it comes to developing countries versus the developed countries. But from there, you'll find what we scrutinize more is the corruption in African leaders. I don't say there's no corruption, there is corruption, but then you find that since people are dealing with all these debates of corruption, they never get to figure out even the tax treaties at an international level might be a very big problem. So tax treaties become a very niche topic that only a few people understand and deal with. But then corruption is more elevated, where people are like, now in terms of taxes, they're like, even if we pay taxes, these leaders will steal our money. So it's quite interesting to see how that plays out in different avenues.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, definitely with that, I think another question then that comes up is, are there things that we can do or indigenous nations can do past research now that we know, okay, this is the problem? Are there things we can do that can help us better to communicate our needs, our requirements, and essentially have more people discussing what their rights are and not being told what their rights and interests should be when it comes to tax paying?
Yeah. It's a big question. It's yeah, I think it's something that I've sort of struggled with actually to think through in relation to what is it that like I suggested in that last point here, where was it in the previous slide, right? What is the sort of ideal tax status? What is it?
Yeah.
What does it look like for Indigenous peoples? And I mean, because ultimately, one of the reasons that a lot of Indigenous people will take the tax exemption that exists in Canada as something that's really important to them, right? Is one of the ideas is like, I'm not paying tax to the colonizer, right? I'm not. Why am I paying to be colonized, right? In the case of Canada, especially as a settler colonial state. But at the same time, there's obviously a lot of debate in Indigenous nations and in First Nations about, well, at some point, if we want to have stronger sovereignty or stronger self-government, are we ourselves going to have to institute and constitute tax for our own purposes? But of course, it's very difficult because there's widespread poverty, right, on reserves in many cases, and things like this. So, you know, there's issues around that. But I think one of the broad things that I'll say is in the case of Canada, especially, and I think also in the case of so many states in Africa, right? You know, ultimately, I think one of the ways that a tax relationship needs to be changed is that Canada needs to conceptualize itself as literally paying rent, right? And in the case probably of most African states, right, the extractive fiscal regimes that existed, right, of British colonialism, German colonialism, whatever European colonialism we're talking about here, right, was the extraction of massive amounts of resources, monies, tax monies, whatever it might be constituted as, right? Well, we need to start thinking about how it is that we write that, right? And in Canada, it might be the fact that since Canada is built on a bunch of Indigenous nations, that Canada, you know, these things need to be conceived of not as tax dollars, but as literally rent to Indigenous nations and reparations. And reparations would probably be the more appropriate case in terms of most African states being colonial states, right? Or formerly colonial states. Anyways, that's one idea.
Yeah, no, definitely it's a good idea. It's also interesting to see how the relationship in Canada is when it comes to settlers and Indigenous communities. And you find that these are really intricate, I would say, relationships. But then when it comes to issues of tax, you think it's something so clear that, you know, you are in this land and it's not really your original land. But then because of the various situations and even the political organization right now, the economic capability between these two different groups gives a huge role in how the outcome comes out. So I think that's quite interesting, and thank you so much for that. We have a question from Polycarp. Kindly unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Wilmot. I hope you can hear me. I have three questions.
Sure.
The first question is about the exemption of indigenous people from taxation and their need to contribute to the development of welfare, the welfare state. Like, how are they exempted from tax and yet they benefit from welfare services? Then the second question, I know the second question goes is about it's sort of a concern, but in Kenya we had the capital gains tax suspended from 1975 to around 2015, and one of the reasons for the suspension was for the development of the property sector. And I've just listened to you a few minutes ago, and you said most of the indigenous people are poor. So is the exemption geared to allow them to actually develop before they actually tax? Obviously, the question of sovereignty comes in, and I want you to address that while you're answering my second question or concern. My third concern would be, you say that the proponents of uniform taxation at the beginning were saying that uniform taxation of the indigenous people and Canadians would bring about conformity in cultural values. And yes, I think to what extent has the exemptions brought about differences between indigenous people and the other Canadians, for lack of a better word? Have there been instances of violence and outward hate because you are exempted and I'm paying tax, I'm paying for your welfare, and such scenarios? Yes.
Great. Yeah. I'm glad I wrote all of this down. Okay. So on the first question, so the exemption operates in a really narrow way. So yes, so you can legally say that somebody who has, and again, like this, the amount of explanation that I require to give to answer one of these questions, I guess the detail, I'll try to go as top level as I can. But so there are certain indigenous people who have rights under the Indian Act, and there are certain indigenous people who have no rights under the Indian Act, right? So I'm only going to deal with the indigenous people who have rights under the Indian Act, even though there's a substantial number of people who don't have those rights. So there is the Section 87 of the Indian Act that obviously says there are certain forms of taxation effectively. And over years, there has been court cases, many court cases, and things like this that have tried to define what those narrow tax exemption rights are. So when you say sort of like, okay, so people are exempted from tax, but would still necessarily benefit from the welfare state, the answer is sort of yes and no. Like I said, most indigenous peoples do not live on reserve, right? And thusly then pay taxes because they will live off of the reserve. They would live like, indigenous, like, live in a city, live in a town, live in wherever you live, and work wherever you work. So that's one element. The other element, of course, would be that many people who do live on reserve, right, still have to pay tax, right, because they work off of reserve, right? So the exemption is super narrow, right? It only really applies to a fairly small population of people that both live and work on reserve, right, and do all of their commerce and shopping and things like this on the reserve. So, I don't think that it would be fair to suggest that's, and this is one of the reasons that I am interested in this idea, is like, how does the idea come about that indigenous people don't pay taxes and therefore sort of, benefiting from welfare, or whatever we want to say in relation to this exemption. But in a way that's how that operates. So many people, there are going to be people that obviously don't pay, right? That are not subject to tax because of the exemption, right? I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but again, that's another issue. Okay, on the second element, the second question that you asked, property rights, was that geared to allow development? Historically, yes, in some respects. But there was political contention, and this was when Canada was forming as a state in the sort of 1860s, 1870s. That where the tax exemption in the Indian Act sort of came from. A lot of politicians, yes, absolutely believed that Indigenous people were not ready for the market, were not ready for property rights, things like this. But then also others simply believed, okay, well, let's tax them and make them participate in the market economy, and thusly that will then solve the problem. So in a way, there was definitely, I think at the time, contention around the tax exemption and whether or not that should be removed to allow for quote unquote development. The other problem, of course, is that ultimately most Indigenous nations themselves did not have the same conception of property rights as the British had, right? As European ideas of property rights. Property was held communally. Property and property rights were held not simply for the benefit of a single person on the market. Things like this. It was a different conceptualization of property, and perhaps property isn't even the right word to describe it at all, right? But as an addendum to that, over the years, absolutely, many people have proposed actually that the taxation itself, right, would allow for development. So there's debate on both elements of those poles. Excuse me. And on the third question, to what sort of extent has this exemption and this differential tax status brought in terms of outward hate, things like this? It's a tough question, but I think the thing that I'm mostly getting at here in the paper was like the discursive element of it. That was like the texts, right? What do people say about these kinds of things? Other people have done a couple of people have done some research, I think, into this in the Canadian context, where yes, Indigenous people have to deal with this comment constantly, right? From a white person saying, well, my tax dollars pay for you. My tax dollars pay for your welfare. As a taxpayer, I shouldn't be paying for your welfare, this sort of thing. While at the same time, these people are literally living off of Canada, the Indigenous land for free, of course. So that was actually the main reason that I started doing this kind of research, right? As a Mohawk person myself, right? I heard these discourses constantly, right? I hear the tax thing constantly. Why don't Indigenous people pay taxes? Is it true that Indigenous people don't pay taxes? Why are my tax dollars subsidizing Native people? Things like this. And so I don't know that I'm going to describe it as outward hate, but I'm going to describe it as a form of fiscalized racism, right? Where people come to see Indigenous people only through this fiscal lens. They come to see Indigenous people as illegitimate, and they come to see Indigenous sovereignty as illegitimate, right? And that the answer ultimately becomes assimilation, right? Why can't you just be like the rest of Canadians, right? Well, because Indigenous people are not Canadians, right? So yeah, it has brought certain forms of political. I don't necessarily, like I said, I don't think I would necessarily call it hate, but I would call it fiscalized racism. And it has informed quite generally a lot of political conduct over the years, and a lot of white resentment toward Indigenous people over the years. like to a fairly large extent, right? Thanks for the questions. Really great questions.
Yeah, so there's something you mentioned about how we see or rather how indigenous communities are placed as spectators. And an interesting thing about the idea of these people being spectators is we see that even if in terms of tax payment, we see that some white settlers may not have enough money to be even taxed, maybe, or they themselves may not be paying taxes.
Right.
But we see that under your paper, there's a portion of it, a section that mentions that, you know, in the Indian Act has been changed a few times, and the changes have allowed some communities to even tax. So I think I would love to hear more about what is the impact, I would say, of at one point the indigenous communities are being placed as spectators, but at another point you'll still find them paying taxes, even if, as you mentioned, it's only in very small sections like property tax that is exempted, and they have to pay all the other taxes maybe. And so the impact of that versus now the white settlers or Canadians who may not even be paying taxes, even if they have been given that status of generally they are all taxpayers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. The tax thing on reserves, the new tax powers, I think in the 88 amendments to the Indian Act, and some other ones as well that more recently were done, I think in 2003 or something like this. Mostly were about attempting to allow bans to the government, First Nations governments, to levy taxes, property taxes for the most part, on non-Indigenous people who lived on the reserve, right? So that was one element of that that property, that certain forms of property could be taxed on the reserve. There's also this commission, the First Nations Tax Commission, that exists, that has proposed a lot of tax changes for First Nations, and there's a huge amount of contention over these things. A lot of people basically see, a lot of Indigenous people basically see, and myself included in sort of this on this side of the debate, see this First Nations Tax Commission in some way as serving an assimilatory drive, right? This sort of drive toward assimilation into Canada. But then in the other case, you have new treaties, what we'll call modern treaties, that actually have eliminated the. So what happens is that often in the modern treaties, the First Nation will no longer be subject to the Indian Act, right? So they're removed from the auspices of the Indian Act, and they have a self-government agreement with the government of Canada, an individual self-government agreement. And usually the Canada requires that in order to go from out of the Indian Act, right, that you give up the tax exemption, right, as an element of movement toward that. And there's various arrangements in which the citizens of those First Nations end up having to pay tax over time. And there's contention, of course, as well over, whether that is just or where those tax dollars come and what the settlements are in exchange for those things in terms of land, right, and rights to land and title to land and property. But the one point that I think you made that's interesting again is this idea, again, this is one of the things that kind of gets me more excited, is this idea, like this I always find it quite interesting that the non-taxpayer as the white settler non-taxpayer that will still conceptualize themselves as a taxpayer, right? And that's the thing to me, again, as somebody that's interested more in the informal elements of tax, right, is so fascinating that people are able to make these judgments. They're able to suggest and think and identify in this particular way when it might actually not even be empirically true. Maybe they didn't make a lot of money that year and they weren't actually subject to the minimum tax, right? To the tax amount, things like this. So but I find that very interesting. Anyways.
Yeah,
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. It does, because you've broken down the different ways Canada is dealing with these issues, and I see that this is a conversation that we can draw a few lessons from in terms of how we also deal with tax payment and different conversations about who is a taxpayer and at what point do you become a taxpayer. Is it when you just reach a legal age that you're a taxpayer? And
right.
Then this conversation of, again, you're in a certain group of people, so maybe or maybe not you're a taxpayer. So I think that is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And
well, I think one other element, sorry to interrupt, one other element of it that's always quite interesting as well is like what tax is imagined as the tax that gives you the status of taxpayer. Because if you do think about it, I mean, you know, like for a VAT, right, or sales tax, right? Yeah. You know, a child could be a taxpayer, right? You know, you buy, a kid buys a pack of gum, right? They're going to be paying a tax on that, right? Yeah. Is the child a taxpayer, right? Yeah. It kind of, I think, exposes the flimsiness in some ways of tax as a political identity, not necessarily as a legal identity, but as a political identity in the way that I deal with it, the sort of the absurdity of it in a way, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think with the way you've described the different identities, the different words used to describe who is a taxpayer, what is a taxpayer supposed to do. And I think these conversations are important because once you have them, you see how policies are made, the policies make a difference on how these words were placed in the first conversation and how the subsequent discussions were made. So it is definitely an interesting conversation, and even as we continue to have these discussions, it's important that we have these different perspectives so that we're also not biased in terms of, but this is the general outlook. So definitely, as we finish up, thank you so much for taking us through the context of how Indigenous communities view taxes, how the Canadian government views taxes, and the different ways that lobbyists and policymakers might use or be affected when it comes to tax conversations. And I think from the chat, we have one last question where it talks about the advice that lawmakers could have that they can make tax policies and how they can convince taxpayers to adhere to these taxes. So I think this is a touching conversation on if there's these conversations between, of course, the Indigenous leaders having to have their taxes, their salaries out there. What then can they do to encourage their citizens to pay taxes, especially now in that context of their salaries are out there, you're talking to people who have maybe different salaries than you. How does that
yeah, I think it touches on one of the questions that was asked earlier that I think is that's about you're right, is about the second question that was asked earlier. I think it's in terms of adherence, right? It's not really a huge issue. I mean, most of the adherence is fairly like normalized, right? Like, you know, like the employer takes your tax away, right? Adherence is not a huge issue. I don't think in the Canadian tax system, because of the institutionalized way that it's like the employer is for the most part responsible for administering tax. So if you are working, if you're an Indigenous person that works off of the reserve, right? Then like your employer deals with that. The tax is already automatically is done. So there's not much in terms of, excuse me, in terms of adherence. But there is obviously that's going to be a different conversation if you're talking about on reserve, where that adherence to me would not actually even be desirable, because it's a literal political right. But a broader element of this question that is interesting is like, okay, like what if we're thinking about Indigenous sovereignty, if we're thinking about how it is that Indigenous nations can have more self-determining power in relation to their territory and not through Canada, right? Whether or not it's the case that First Nations will eventually have to institute particular kinds of tax regimes is an interesting one. But I don't think that there necessarily would be a problem with adherence in the same way that this questioner might be asking, because for the most part, most people are used to it, right? And that the administrative capacity is already kind of there in a way, right? People are used to it. They know that it's the case, things like this. So yeah, I'm not sure that adherence is a huge issue, but the issue of convincing, right, would certainly is another issue. So thanks for the question.
Yeah. Wonderful. So as we close up this conversation, I hope that we can keep thinking about these matters and understanding more about how different contexts of tax affect us and the global arena. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much, Professor Kyle Wilmot, for taking us through this discussion.